My name is Sikyong, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our inaugural seminar titled The Relevance of Tibet to India, Past, Present, and Future. The seminar promises to be a thought-provoking session which will explore the profound historical, cultural, and strategic connections between Tibet and India. As two neighbors bound by geography, history, and shared values, the relationship between India and Tibet is unique and continues to evolve in many significant ways. We are privileged to have with us an esteemed panel of experts who will provide their insights on the seminar on relevance of Tibet to India, past, present, and future. It is my honor to introduce our chairperson and speaker for this session. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. Dr. Sreeram Chaulia is a professor and dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs and Director General of the Jindal India Institute of Arpi Jindal Global University in Sonipat, India. He is a leading opinion columnist for Dainik Jagran and Hindustan Times on world affairs and a commentator on international current issues on radio and television. He anchors the Indian diplomacy TV show on India's national broadcast channel, Doordarshan. Dr. Chaulia, we are honored to have you with us. May I kindly invite you to the stage? We are also honored to have with us four eminent speakers who will share their perspective on the title, The Relevance of Tibet to India, Past, Present, and Future. Now, I would like to invite our esteemed speakers to join Dr. Chaulia on stage. Honorable Sikyong Penpa Tsering from the Central Tibetan Administration. Ambassador Dilip Sinha. Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, sir. And Claude Arpi. With our distinguished panel now assembled, I will hand over the session to Dr. Sreeram Chaulia to kindly introduce our speakers and chair the session.
Thank you. Namaste. Tashi Delek. Spirit of Tibet, we should be celebrating it in Lhasa with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the Potala Palace. But we are doing it in exile in his second home, India. The first home, the homeland, is of course under occupation and has been brutally colonized and exploited for the last almost 70 years now. But the Central Tibetan Administration has kept the identity and the cause alive in exile, and so that's how we are gathered all here. I just wanted to share briefly a small anecdote before we start. I was in Sikkim this summer, and as you know, outside Gangtok there is the magnificent Rumtek monastery, and I went there. It was just a clear day, and you could see the Himalayan peaks all around, and it was so serene, and the monks were chanting and doing the prayers, and with total freedom. and no restrictions whatsoever. And then subsequent day I went to the Nathula Pass, and we were right on at the LAC, and people were taking pictures, and it was like a celebratory mood among the Indian tourists at the LAC at Nathula. And I was wondering, everybody was saying उस तरफ चाइना है, ये चाइना का बॉर्डर है, उस तरफ चाइना है. And of course they had the big the red flag and the photographs of Mao Zedong and others on that side in giant visual imagery. Nobody was saying ये Tibet है. I'm talking about Indians. And then I said, Romtek, just a few dozen miles from there to the border, and then beyond that, on the other side, there is no freedom. There is oppression, and the monks only have the Dalai Lama in their hearts. They can't even utter his name. So that is chalk and cheese. That is what Chinese occupied Tibet is, and that is what the second homeland for Tibet is here. They are freer here than in their native lands. So I just reflected on that and said, what a great country India is, that we've been able to, preserve this great community of non-violent people and ancient traditions and culture, and one of the great Asian civilizations alive, that India could do this, despite all the pressures and the incentives that have been thrown at us for so many decades. So why have we done this? Why are the Tibetans our sisters and brothers? Why do they have a homeland here, a second homeland here? And what is the meaning of all this for the future of Tibet and for the cause of Tibet? These are some of the themes I hope we can discuss today in this opening panel. Keeping in mind that India will remain the main center from which this seemingly lost cause of reclaiming the homeland, if at all it can happen in our lifetimes, it can happen because of the exiled community here, and because of the Central Tibetan administration, and because of the youth and the volunteers who are doing so much hard work to keep the cause alive. So I wanted to put that out first, so that we know that India has done a lot, and from His Holiness to His Excellency Sikyong and his entire administration, they have kept insisting that, without India, nothing would be possible. So we are so proud of this legacy. But it's also a question as to what more India can do, and what is the importance of Tibet to India. So we're going to be exploring that with a real power-packed panel today. And it's a real privilege for me to have extraordinary thinkers and strategists with me, all well-known names who don't need an introduction, but I'll still mention Sikyong Penpa Tsering, is the Prime Minister of the Tibetan administration, and is also the representative of the democratic values of the Tibetan people. Those who say, the PRC says that Dalai Lama is a feudal lord and that he was running a feudal aristocracy. You have actually the opposite here, which is, it's actually a democratic system that they've been able to create, that the people living in the occupied Tibet are deprived of this democracy. They don't have any rights to even elect their own leaders or even run their own monasteries. But here in the exile, people vote, universal adult franchise, free will of the Tibetan people. And that's how we have Sikyong elected. And it's a great institution, because one day, whenever they can reclaim the homeland, this is the model to be replicated up there in Lhasa. He's, of course, a very well-known public figure and has worked for the cause and for the community for many decades, and it's a real honor to have him here with us. I want to also welcome Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, a very senior retired military officer from the Indian Army, decorated officer who has worked as Director General Military Operations, has commanded many important regiments and held high positions in the Indian military, and knows the LAC area. This what our tourists were calling the India-China border. you know, it's 890 kilometers or so is the McMahon line. The total LAC is 4,000, they say the border is 4,057 kilometers approximately. But 890 is actually Tibet out of that, right? So, so he knows this region very well, the strategic and the military dimension, and we are going to be exploring that also, because that's important from the Indian national security point of view. Also with me, I'm very privileged to have Ambassador Dilip Sinha. Ambassador Sinha is a distinguished member of the Indian Foreign Service fraternity. He retired a few years ago and has been India's ambassador to the UN, our permanent representative to the United Nations, and has held many senior positions representing India, and is a very, very knowledgeable thinker. He's the author of a widely read book called Imperial Games in Tibet, the struggle for statehood and sovereignty. So welcome, Ambassador, so much. And last but not least, I noticed that our young friend who is the MC did not even have to introduce Claude Arpi. She just called him on stage without even mentioning anything in terms of an institutional affiliation or designation, because he is the person who has written and explained the Tibetan problem to the world like nobody else. I think we have run out of the number of books he has authored, the number of articles, the granular detail to which he has gone to explain the tragedy of Tibet. I don't think anybody else can. So welcome to, I would call him more easily the world's most eminent Tibetologist, or at least one of the most. One of the most. So greatly honored to have this great scholar and thinker amongst us. Okay, so India's, the importance of Tibet to India, the relevance of Tibet to India. I'd like to start by requesting Honorable His Excellency Sikyong, your experience of this country, what it means for your community, for your people, for your administration, and the kind of cooperation you have always received from various governments over the decades here in Delhi. And please tell the audience what India means to you personally and to your people.
Thank you, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. I've been watching him on DD India to understand India's strategic positions in the region and internationally. So I'm meeting you personally for the first time. It's really a privilege. He finished his 99th interview on strategic affairs, and he's going to come up with 100th in DD India. So congratulations to you for your extremely wonderful job that you're doing on DD India. Claude, we were friends for more than 3 decades, since my Pondicherry days. And when Dr. Sreeram was talking about him being maybe the most, he wants the mic to shut off. So we have a very modest French person with us, who have been very close with, closely linked with the Tibetan issue for many decades now, since 1972 or so, or maybe earlier. 72. And then I'm meeting Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia ji for the first time, and Ambassador Dilip Sinha ji we just met in Dharamsala 1 or 2 weeks ago. So it's really a pleasure for me to be amongst such luminaries, scholars, who have really spent a lot of time studying about Tibet and understanding the importance of Tibet. Now, responding to Dr. Sreeram's, of course, before I go on, I want to thank the organizers, the Department of Information and International Relations, who has taken the lead in organizing this exhibition, which is supported very much by the USAID, and the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives and Tibet Fund. 4 of them, along with a lot of other partners, have organized this event, and this is coming after many years. When I used to work here as director of Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center way back, we did organize a 1-week Festival of Compassion in India Habitat Center. at that time. So that was many years ago, some 2 decades ago, and now we are back here. Particularly during the pandemic, there was nothing much happening on Tibet in Delhi. And it's good to see a lot of our old friends here, Ambassador Ranjit Guptaji, who, when I was here, we used to depend on him for most of our talks to participate. And then Vijay Krantiji, O.P. Tendonji, and some of many members of the core group are also here because they had a meeting coinciding with this event. So thank you all very much for your interest and support for Tibet, continued support, very, very important. As a Tibetan, responding to Dr. Sreeram's question, I've never been to Tibet. I was born in India, so I always tell my Kannadiga friends that we might look a little different, but mentally we are all Indian. Because if you go back in history, talk about the past, there were also contesting stories about the first king of Tibet having come from India. And that is about 2,200 years ago. And we have a history of several centuries before that. And so our relation with India goes back to more than 2,200 years ago. And then Lathotori Nyenzen received the sacred texts, which he could not decipher, but which was eventually, at that time, there were no Tibetan language, written script. And then the Tibetan script also came from India, from the Brahmi and Gupta script in 7th century during King Songtsen Gampo. And then Buddhism came to Tibet in 8th century through Shantarakshita and Guru Padmasambhava and all that. And then before Buddhism vanished, almost vanished out of India from 10th to 13th century, many Tibetan masters went to India to study Buddhism. And then they came up with new traditions like the Sakyapas or the Kagyupas and later the Gelugpas, apart from the Nyingmapas, which were already there from 8th century. And we transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali text into Tibetan. So today, we are a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom, which we are very proud, and that is manifested in the messages of His Holiness the Dalai Lama around the world. Now, personally, I'm born to Tibetan parents. The Ambassador Dilip Sinha ji has also written a piece of history which is not very known to Tibetans also. When I also spoke about this, many Tibetans were, we never heard about this. Like 1206, there was the invasion of Tibet by Bhatia Khilji from Kuch Bihar. He sent 10,000 army and only 100 returned back. That was in 1206, even though Tibet was disintegrated, but still powerful to defend its own country in 1206. So as a Tibetan, I feel very much part of India because our way of life is shaped by our Buddhist thought. And Buddhist thought comes from India, which is again very much related to Hinduism and other religions that sprouted from India. So we always feel that we feel very close. Even now when we talk about the colonial style boarding schools in Tibet, where more than 1 million Tibetan children has been put in colonial-style boardings, and when you ask the Chinese government, they point fingers at the United States and say, how did the Americans treat the Red Indians or the Native Americans or the Canadians or the First Nations or the Maoris in New Zealand or, the indigenous people, Aboriginals in Australia. So which means to say that Chinese government knows exactly what they are doing, and to destroy Tibetan identity right now. So that is also one way of changing the emotional quotient of the Tibetans towards the Indians. Because the first thing that comes in our mind when we talk about India-Tibet relations is His Holiness catchword, Guru Chela. So we have always been the Chela to India, and that much respect we have. We call India the Aryavrat. In Tibetan, we say the Phagwe Yu. So Tibetans have a lot of respect. Now, if all the younger generations of Tibetans are changed into Chinese, the way they think, the way they behave, the way they talk, then that emotional quotient will also change. So there may not be new generations of Tibetans who would have the same reverence for India and the same affinity for India. So there, of course, in this topic, there are a lot of things that we can discuss, but there is very little time, and there are experts. I think Claude will speak more about the border. Then you also have Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia ji talking about the security angle. Then Ambassador Dilip ji had covered the whole gamut of Tibetan history. So you have experts to speak about this, but I just want to touch about the strategy that we have adopted. After I came into this position, of course, we followed the middle way policy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That was proposed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, approved by majority of Tibetans, and also ratified by the Tibetan Parliament in exile. So this remains our official policy to find a solution that's based on non-violence, that's based on negotiation, mutually beneficial, that could be lasting. Because violent solutions can never be lasting, because non-violence solution will always be lasting. So that is why we need to focus more on non-violence. So I'm the elected political leader right now, but I don't have the right to change the policy of the government. So the policy remains the same, but we decided to change the strategy a little bit, because when we talk about middle way, then you talk about polarities or extremities. So, of course, there could be so many polarities when you define political or social or, ecological, economic, a lot of things, but I don't want to touch the polarities on other issues, but except the political part, where one polarity is the present situation of Tibet under the repressive communist government, and the other polarity is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. So the present status of Tibet under the repressive Chinese government, we keep talking about it to the international community all the time. But the historical aspect of Tibet, we have not talked so much. So we decided to focus on this, and we worked with the US government for a little more than 2 years to get this Resolve Tibet Act passed. And we have bipartisan, bicameral support in the United States, and that has really helped us in pushing this bill. And we would like to work with other governments to see whether similar positions can be adopted to push the Chinese government to come on the negotiating table. So that is when I travel around the world, I keep telling the governments that if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of China, then you are going against international law. Because whether it's happening to Ukraine today or whether it happened to Tibet more than 70 years ago, it was the same international law. And the second thing we tell them is, on the one hand, they keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, and on the other hand, they keep saying we support negotiations between His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. So I say, you are removing the very ground for negotiation. When every country says Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? And the third thing we tell them is, why do you think the Chinese government is asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC? Why not Mongolia? Why not Uyghur? Why not other regions within Tibet? That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule in Tibet. And that is why they are trying to seek that legitimacy from the international community. Even now, if you listen to the Chinese spokesperson on various issues, they always keep saying, oh, the Tibetan government in exile is not recognized by any government in the world. That is how they prove their legitimacy, of their rule in Tibet. So we have to puncture those theories. And there are also, I think Dr. Sreeram also very rightly mentioned about his visit to Rumtek, and on the other side you have Tibet, but people call it China. So this is one of my grouse against the Indian media also. Why don't you call it Indo-Tibetan border? Because that was the historical fact. We never knew that we had a border with China on the northern side. There was never ever China on the Tibet's northern side. It was only on the eastern side. On the southern side, you have only India. In the past, there has never ever been a war between India and Tibet because of the Himalayas, right? So, except with what you have mentioned about the Kanauj incident, and then the Bakhtiar Khilji incident in 13th century, then you have the Dogra War. Maybe we had 2 to 3 wars with Nepal. And Bhutan was also carved out of Tibet. So China still calls Tawang as southern Tibet. They don't call it southern China or whatever. And the Indian government still kept the name Indo-Tibetan Friendship, Indo-Tibetan Border Police, Indo-Tibetan Border Force. So I keep saying that also underlies the Indian government's position on the border or on a larger issue of Tibet. So this is how we are trying to reach out to the international community. We have been a bit successful in the United States. Now we have to work with the United States to see how best we can convince other governments to adopt similar positions, because China has been working on this for the last several decades to push every government to say Tibet is part of PRC. Now we have to work all over again to backtrack that position and assert our position, which is the reality. I think Ram Manohar Lohia, or somebody, a very famous socialist, has said that communism is built on the foundation of lies. And this is exactly what is happening. China is in a very denial mood all the time. They are always in the denial mode. They don't accept any of the realities that are happening there. They think they are the big brother. They are the biggest bully in the world. And they are also try to take the other bullies with them to create a new international order. Now it's not just China. They are talking about global civilizational initiative, global security initiative, global economic initiative. So what they are aiming at is not just changing China or increase its hegemonistic ambitions in the region. We started from invasion of Tibet and Uyghur those days, and now you have Chinese on the Indian border, right next to you. Right, so there are a lot of issues that can be discussed, that will be discussed, and there are other panelists who will take on from here. And I want to thank you again for this opportunity and to be sharing this platform with all these luminaries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sikyong. Yes, he spoke about many aspects. Let me take on the diplomatic aspect now. He already spoke about the crucial role of the international community. And of course, India is the base from which everything emanates, but the US has also been quite supportive. And this is something I want to take up with Ambassador Dilip Sinha. Lately, this event itself is supported by USAID, and that's great to see that, you know, it's a kind of a triangular cooperation where it's happening in India with American support. And Ambassador Sinha, recently we also saw this congressional delegation from the US that came and went to Dharamsala and met the leadership there. And again, right after that, our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, met the delegation, and even Prime Minister Narendra Modi met the US congressional delegation. So obviously, this is part of the broader global geopolitical contestation also. And Tibet has always been, as you yourself have written and spoken often. So it does look like, as Sikyong was saying, the US is willing to step up the accelerator and do more now in the current context where their so-called extreme competition with China is intensifying worldwide. And probably they see a value in upping the ante on the Tibet issue. And that's why we are seeing more movement. The act that was recently passed in the US Congress is one example. And India, of course, is facilitating many of these things. So it's a kind of one of the lesser spoken aspects of the US-India comprehensive global strategic partnership also, isn't it, Tibet? And people often don't talk, more people focus on Indo-Pacific and, you know, Quad and, maritime domains where we are trying to push back the Chinese hegemony. But here in the heartland of Asia also, you know, there is a contest. There always has been a contest, and people know from history. Claude Arpi has written so much of, you know, what happened 1950s, 60s. US, India were always together to some extent on this issue. Although there have been times when the US also changed its positions. So could you reflect on this? I mean, Indian diplomacy and Indian foreign policy, especially with the US and with other countries, how much of it has been effective in promoting the Tibetan cause and keeping the Tibetan cause alive? And what more you think we can do proactively from Indian foreign policy standpoint, apart from coordinating with the US, to make sure that our national interests, which are so closely tied with the Tibetan cause, are upheld and strengthened?
Thank you, Dr. Chaulia. Honorable Sikyong, General Bhatia, and of course, our guru, Claude Arpi. No, you have to call him a guru because even when I was writing my book, I would often consult with him to check out certain facts because I'm not an expert on Tibet, but I have tried to understand some international politics around it to be able to explain why nobody questions China's claim to Tibet. Now, in India, of course, there is a great deal of misunderstanding or lack of knowledge of Tibet. Tibet is our largest neighbor historically. And it has also been the most peaceful neighbor historically. The number of times an army, as the Honorable Sikyong pointed out, has crossed the border can be counted on your fingertips of one hand. The people who crossed the border were monks, they were priests, they were traders, and they were pilgrims. And Tibet is also India's lost neighbor because there's very little understanding of Tibet in India, very little knowledge of China's claim and how it came about. Dr. Chaulia mentioned about India's policy. Now, India after independence essentially followed the British policy, which was to recognize Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. Now, India did so for a different set of reasons than the British. The British had their reasons, and the British reasons were essentially Britain's great game with Russia in Central Asia. Because around the middle of the 19th century, when Russia started expanding into Central Asia, the British felt threatened for the security of their empire in India. And this was the time when the Chinese empire in Central Asia, which was the Manchu Empire or the Qing Empire, had become very weak because of internal problems and because of the European predations on the Pacific coast. So Britain was unsure whether to take Tibet under its own control or to let it remain within China. Now, the problem in taking over Tibet under British control was that Russia was very strongly opposed to it. So Britain actually helped China in reconquering Tibet and Xinjiang, especially Xinjiang, because Tibet, although it had become practically independent in the middle of the 19th century, Tibet never really revolted against the British rule. Whereas East Turkestan, or what China calls Xinjiang, had actually revolted against Chinese rule. And the Chinese were thrown out of East Turkestan, and Yaqub Beg had become the ruler. And when the civil war was going on in China, called the Taiping Rebellion, the British helped China suppress the Taiping Rebellion and then helped finance the army that went and reconquered East Turkestan for the Manchu dynasty. And then Britain tried to settle the status of Tibet. It initially sent one young husband to invade Tibet. When Britain invaded Tibet and the 13th Dalai Lama fled from Lhasa, the country to protest the strongest was Russia. And when you go through the correspondence between the British embassy in St. Petersburg and the Russian government, you find the Russian government protesting very strongly against British presence. And finally, the British, of course, withdrew immediately. And in 1907, there was the Anglo-Russian Convention, which settled the borders between, or the frontier between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. So the convention is called the Convention relating to Tibet, Afghanistan, and Iran. Now, it was decided that Tibet would be under Chinese suzerainty. And as part of that deal, Britain was allowed to keep 3 trade centers in Tibet, in Shigatse, Gartok, and Gyantse. But in Lhasa, they were not allowed to keep any representative. No mission was allowed to be opened in Lhasa, and no concession could be taken like mining concession or railway concession in Tibet by the British. So this was the restrictions that Russia placed upon Britain. And they both agreed that Tibet would remain under the suzerainty of China because they felt that that was the best way to ensure that neither Russia nor Britain took over Tibet. Now, India, after independence, continued that British policy, but for a different reason. India wasn't an imperial power, it had no concerns about Russia. But India's concern was to bring about an Asian resurgence against European imperialism. And India felt that China, with its communism, its new ideology, was the country that could be partners of this Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai idea, that India and China would together raise Asian resurgence and consciousness against European imperialism. India failed to understand that China itself was an imperial power. And what was happening was that the Manchu Empire, which had collapsed when the Manchu dynasty collapsed in 1912 or 1911, thereafter, when the Communist Party came back to power, the Communist Party's first aim was to recover the Manchu Empire, which is how the claim to Tibet and the claim to Taiwan. And as now I think the Prime Minister or the President of Taiwan has pointed out that if China claims Taiwan, why doesn't it claim Manchuria also? Because parts of Manchuria are occupied by Russia. So that is all part of the old Manchu Empire. So this is the history behind the reason why. Now the US policy also, the US was a little undecided around the time of the communist takeover of China about what policy to follow. And when Tibet appealed to the United Nations for help in 1950, and the matter came up before the General Assembly, the US was inclined to support it, but Britain, and there's a record there, Britain dissuaded America from supporting that cause. And Britain told America that you go by what India says, and since India felt that there could be a peaceful agreement between Tibet and China, India decided that it would not support the appeal and that it would ask for postponement. So the matter, when it came up in the General Assembly in November 1950, India and Britain proposed that the matter be postponed so that further talks could take place between Tibet and China on a peaceful resolution. And America then supported that. Russia at that time opposed the UN taking up the Tibetan cause because Russia felt that Tibet was a part of China. In any case, Russia had also helped China in its invasion of Tibet. So that was how the big powers at that time in the UN broadly accepted that suzerainty of China was legitimate over Tibet. And of course, the UN never took up the matter again thereafter, except in the sense of human rights violations and cultural. The word genocide was also used at one of the resolutions in the UN of the cultural genocide taking place in Tibet. But the question of the right of self-determination was mentioned in one of the resolutions, but thereafter it kind of got faded. But it is reassuring to note that in the new act that the US has passed, the word self-determination has been recognized as it is there in the UN Charter itself. Now, of course, India and Tibet, our links go back into geography as well as Buddhism, which is our common heritage. I don't think we should call Buddhism as having gone from India. It is a common heritage of the Buddha's teachings are universal in nature, and we are all blessed to have had him give us the wisdom that he did. And it is also important to remember that when Nalanda University was destroyed by the Turkic invaders, a lot of the textbooks from Nalanda were taken by monks, both Indian and Tibetan, and they were preserved in Tibet. And it was in the 20th century that Mahapandit Rahul Sankrityayan, when he went to Tibet, he brought back some of these texts. And those texts are kept in Patna Museum today. And that way they were preserved because thereafter came the Cultural Revolution that China inflicted on Tibet. And a lot of the records and historical texts were destroyed in Tibet itself. On the geographical relevance, I need hardly mention anything more than the fact that Tibet is considered to be the third pole of the earth. And the permafrost, the glaciers, the snow in Tibet, that determines the climate of the continent of Asia, especially the Asian monsoon that we see here today, that is greatly influenced by the Tibetan plateau and its impact on the climate, as well as, of course, water sources. 4 of our main rivers, the Ghagra, the Brahmaputra, the Indus, and the Satluj, originate from Tibet. And according to Indian mythology, even the Ganga originates from Mansarovar. Of course, they said that the Ganga flows underneath the Himalayas and then comes out in Gomukh as the Ganga River. So for us, as well as for all of Southeast Asia, China as well, Tibet is a source of rivers. Historically, it's not just in terms of religion, not just Buddhism, but Mount Kailash is the abode of Lord Shiva. and it is a mountain that's holy to both Buddhists, Bons, and Jains. One interesting point that I would like to mention is that twice in the recent past, last century or so, two Dalai Lamas, the 13th and the 14th, have had to flee Lhasa because of foreign invasion. Now, where did they go? When the British invaded Lhasa in 1904, the 13th Dalai Lama fled. He fled to Mongolia, not to China. Then, when China invaded in 1910, then 13th Dalai Lama, who had come back to Lhasa by that time, he fled to India. Again, the 14th, His Holiness, when he had to flee, when China invaded in 1950, he fled to India. That shows the kind of trust and confidence that leaders in Tibet have to the fact that the closeness with India, that when they are in trouble, they can turn either to Mongolia or to India, not to China, which is supposedly the motherland of the country. On the importance of the Chinese insecurity in Tibet, I'll just mention two instances of talks that took place in 1961. Now, 1961 is after the His Holiness and the refugees had the invasion already taken place, and Dalai Lama had taken shelter in India. A delegation went from India to China in 1961, led by Mr. Arpi Nehru, who was Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry. And they were talking to Zhou Enlai in Beijing. This was one of the last talks that took place before the border war that we had with China. And the Indian ambassador, Mr. Parthasarathi, mentioned to Mr. Zhou Enlai, I am glad that the Tibet issue is now in the past. Now, Mr. Zhou Enlai immediately interrupted him and said, that is wrong. The issue is not in the past. The Dalai Lama is still in India, and he is conducting activities against the motherland, activities destructive of Sino-Indian friendship. So, in Chinese mind, the fact that the Dalai Lama was in India was itself a hostile act, and an act that made them feel insecure about their presence in Tibet. And soon after that, Zhou Enlai wrote a letter to about 20 heads of governments of the global south countries. And there again he said that India was supporting an insurgency of serf owners in Tibet, giving shelter to them and letting them carry out activities against China from Indian soil. He accused Prime Minister Nehru of raising large-scale territorial demands against China in the wake of the insurgency. So it is this insecurity that China feels in Tibet that is the important thing. So that is, I will just conclude by saying that as long as the India-Tibet border was the India-Tibet border, it was the most peaceful. And when it became the India-China border, it has become a security nightmare for our country. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Sinha, for laying out a wide panorama of issues, especially with regard to the security concerns. And let me now come to that point in particular, and bring in Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia. General, we now have a situation with heavy militarization and mirror deployment for almost 3.5 years now, since 2024, almost 4 years now. And not only in the Ladakh side, but all along. And there have been incidents with the PLA involving our armed forces, their attempts to infiltrate and to expand their claims. We are seeing a very, very aggressive China, a very, very hyper-nationalistic and expansionist China, and one which is out to try and intimidate or browbeat its neighbors. So in this context, if you could just reflect on the situation along the LAC and also our options going forward, because it's quite disturbing to see that the Chinese are also mobilizing some Tibetan youth to fight on their side against the Indian army, and trying to push them to the frontiers which are disputed. So this is also a cause of great concern, because as Sikyong was saying, if the younger generation in the occupied Tibet do not know the history and are kept in the dark or are subject to brainwashing and ideological propaganda by the communist regime, we could actually see a split between the community in the exile and the people living in the mainland, in the homeland. And this has major security implications for us also, if they are going to use Tibetans and arm them to counter India and to counter the Tibetan community in exile. So if you could please bring in all those elements and talk about Tibet for us as a buffer, and what will be our ideal position. Right now the Chinese are not willing to compromise at all on any of the border negotiations we've been having. There are more than 25 rounds, if I'm not wrong, and it's been going on forever, and they dilly-dally and never settle, and they want to keep on raising new claims. So here, some people say that Tibet is a bargaining chip, and some people say that maybe if we make concessions on Tibet on one side, they will make concessions on the other side, in terms of a package deal and all that. But I think Tibet is something much bigger, right? It cannot just be a card. Ultimately, we would want restoration of the pre-1950 status quo for India to be really secure. And right now, the Chinese will not be willing to play ball because they think they have the advantage. So please reflect on this fact and what our forces are doing to repel the Chinese, and what more we want in terms of autonomy and sovereignty of Tibet, and how that will really probably ultimately bring about Hindi Chini Bye Bye. Hindi Chini Bye Bye is possible if Tibet's status is restored, I think. Please, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sreeram. Thank you. There are a number of questions on this. Firstly, the organizer, thank you. Honored to be here, an honor indeed, and what a great opportunity to learn. His Excellency, thank you very much. Ambassador Sinha, thank you very much. Chair. And of course, Mr. Claude Law. I don't read what you write, I always study what you write. So there's a lot of learning out here. Now, coming to the questions proper, I think we need to understand China. Tibet we know, India we know. And honestly, let me tell you, I don't understand China. The more I read about China, the more I realize that so little of China I know, especially what they want to do, how they do, why they do things. No, it's a fact. China's strategy has always been, as I put it, it is claim, occupy, legitimize, impose, exploit, and integrate. Just the 6 steps. First, they'll claim the area, then they'll go and occupy the area, then they have some legal things, and they read the law as they want to read it, and then they will impose themselves, they'll exploit the people, and then they'll integrate it finally into China. Mao Zedong went to Egypt in the early 50s, and they realized that when Egyptians told him that the Egyptian civilization is 5,000 years old, and the Chinese civilization is always 1,500 to 2,000 years old as per their narrative at that point of time, he came back, he got hold of the historians and the academicians, he said, I want the Chinese civilization to be more than 5,000 years old. This is as per some of the reports. And that is how the Chinese civilization became older, and they started claiming more areas, more and more areas, and the sensitivity of the 3 T's, as they call it, Tibet, Taiwan, and Turkmenistan, East Turkmenistan. So that is the sensitivities. And coming down to the question proper, let me start, of course, there's senior veterans out here, and I say that a lot of responsibility. India is absolutely, the Indian troops and the Indian armed forces are there, they're alert, and let me reassure you on everyone that China, whatever the intent are, strategic intent, their operational thing, we are well entrenched, and we have the support of the people of the border areas, which is very essential to make sure that we negate whatever they want to do. Right. Now, a word about the line of actual control. We talk about earlier when we were youngsters, and of course I have General Sanjeev Langa, my old colleague sitting out here, senior veterans, we used to always call it the Indo-Tibetan border. We used to call it Tibetan Autonomous Region. But somewhere in the mid-70s, it started changing. We started calling it the India-China border. And then we started in 2005, the ICBR, the India-China border roads came up. And then the line of actual control is a Chinese construct. It's not an Indian construct. The line of actual control came up, and then it suddenly became India-China. So the Chinese think long-term, honestly. They think long-term, and they like I said, they want to legalize things, and they make you forget what actually the history was. And it's so good to see the Tibetan culture today, the way you have preserved it, the recorded it, history. I think it's absolutely excellent, and that should be consolidated. Now, line of actual control, if I may put it, is basically a line of perceptions. It is not one line, it's not two lines, it's not three lines, it's 4 lines. One is the line of actual control as India perceives it. Second is line of actual control as Chinese perceive it. Third is the line of actual control as India perceives the Chinese perception of line of actual control. We have our own way of, seeing where they come from, what date they come. So we have that perception. And the fourth of the Chinese perception, Indian perception, line of actual control. So in all this chaos, and I'm not an expert, like I said, but I have walked some of the LAC. So in all this chaos, we have maintained relative peace and tranquility over the years. The last shot in anger was fired in 1975, 25th October. And of course, then we had Galwan. Galwan, I term is as China's Himalayan blunder. Because if you look at the geopolitics, the world order is shifting from the west to the east. And as China challenges the US for a bipolar world, it will need India as a risen, responsible, resurgent nation, a regional power, a global leader on its side, if not at least neutral India. But what China has done out of Galwan, India had forgotten 62. Honestly, the youth had forgotten 62. 660 million youth. For them, 1962 was past history. Our memory is very short. But Galwan has made them now anti-China. So 660 million youth is now not looking at China in a very friendly way. So that is why I call this in 2 ways, the geopolitical order and the way the Indians now look at China as an anti-China, as a Himalayan blunder. The chair spoke about the negotiations. Yes, we have had negotiations. We had about 21, 22 rounds of the co-commander level talks. We had about 31 talks of the WMCC, which is a working mechanism for cooperation and coordination. We have been speaking at the diplomatic level. We've been speaking at the political level between the Raksha Mantri and the foreign minister and their foreign minister. As long as we are talking, I think we have hope. And the fact is that we're talking from a position of relative strength. I'm not saying position of strength, position of relative strength. And if you look at it, we want status quo ante as of 4th of May 2020. That's our stance. And they had come and occupied 6 different areas. And from 4 of these areas, they have vacated those areas and gone back to the original position. Only 2 areas are left of contestation. So I think we've not done badly. If you look at China, after 1979 Vietnam, this is the only time that they have come, occupied, and they've gone back. So we've been able to push them through as we have been able to defend our positions at the military level, at the diplomatic level. But then there's much more to it. There's geopolitics there. There's economics there. The economic angle has to come in. We're talking about China. When we talk about China, China is the largest trading partner with 80 countries, 80 nations. Trade with China is growing. We can have Make in India. But China, which is the factory of the world today, is the laboratory of the world. We have to understand that. The interdependence between China and the US. That is why if you look at US endorses the one China policy. India endorses one China policy. So we'll have to look at realities. While the aspirations of the Tibetan people are exceedingly important, and we have to, we hope that they will be met at some point of time, and we've got to keep it alive. But the fact is that we have to look at a little bit of realism and see what China is doing. And China has legitimized its occupation of the areas. So that is what we should be looking at. As far as the military angle is concerned, I think we'll have to build a lot of capabilities. We'll have to enhance capacities. And the problem is that long-term peace, stability, and economic development go hand in hand. It's the chicken and the egg comes first. Security and economic are interrelated. If you have good economy growing, you'll have better security. If you don't have security, you'll not have economy. So that is where I think we need a good balance of it. Looking at the wars which we have fought, 62 was a debacle. There's no doubt about it. Hinduchini by 1.0 as I call it. And we learned our lessons and we came back very early in 1967 Nathala. You mentioned Nathala. I've been deployed there in Nathala. Yes, we call it the Chinese hurt, the Chinese soldiers. We should call it Tibet. You're absolutely right out there. But then the Indian perception is now changing. It's always Chinese. We've got to keep Tibet alive. How we keep Tibet alive is along the line of actual control. We should start saying it is Tibet on the other side. That is something we should, at least at the ground level, we should always remind China that you are occupiers, you have occupied this territory, it is Tibetan territory. And I salute the people of Tibet. They've kept this alive. They have been, we have cultural linkages, we have connectivity, we have commerce, we have neighbors. And Tibetan community is one of the most respected communities in India. We never hear of any law and order problems from the Tibetan community. We hear from law and order problems from so many other communities, even smaller communities. But Tibetan community, enterprising, they have integrated well in many ways, and they have contributed in all aspects, whether it's economy or security. The last bit which you asked, what do we do from here, security-wise? Because security is very important. Otherwise, you'll be found, if you're weak, you're asking for trouble. With China, it is basically war prevention. We need to make sure that we have conventional deterrence so that they don't do what they want to do. Their strategic intent is very clear, occupy more and more areas. China actually looks at 6 wars, if I may say so. And this is from the Chinese. I'm not talking about, most of our thing comes from the Western perspective. We read literature from the West, but some of the Chinese literature, very, very interesting what they read of. They talk about 6 wars. The first war is unification of Taiwan. And it comes with a timeline. The timeline is 2020 to 2026. So we've still got another 2 years to go. The second was capture of Spratly Islands from 2026 to 2030. The third is reconquest of South Tibet. Very interesting. Reconquest South Tibet. They claim Arunachal Pradesh, 70,000 square kilometers of it. And that timeline they put as 2030 to 2040. And the fourth war is the reconquest of Senkaku Islands, 2040 to 2050. The fifth was unification of Mongolia, 2045 to 2050. And the sixth war, which very few talk about, is the reclaiming the lands lost to Russia. And that is 2060 onwards, 2050 to 2060. So that is what China is looking at. This comes from a Chinese write-up where a journalist in Hong Kong has been privy to military discussions. So if that is what they're looking at, we've got to be prepared for it. And you ask me, what does India do? I'll take a minute and do that. We need, and this is not the government of India, we need a 4D strategy. We need to defend the line of actual control. Without that, nothing can move forward. We need to dominate the sea lines of communication, especially the 8 choke points in the Indian Ocean, because that is where China's vulnerabilities are. We need deft diplomacy to bind to balance with nations where we have congruence and convergence of interests. And last but not the least, which I find very difficult happening, we need to deny space to China in the neighborhood. China is taking space in the neighborhood and isolating India. And that's what we call the Spring Wars. Thank you.
Thank you, General Bhatia. Yeah, he laid out these strategic imperatives for India. And let me now bring in Claude, Arpi. We heard about the 6 wars, and sometimes the Chinese have also spoken about the 5 fingers, which make the fist, and Tibet is one of them. So this obsession for Tibet, I mean, we understand what they claim, and you have written over years, but what do you foresee going forward, given this hardline extremist kind of a regime of Xi Jinping? And are they, the Americans who came, for example, and have been saying that the negotiations should restart for genuine autonomy in Tibet, right? But the Chinese obviously are in no mood and they don't care. In fact, they think that there is some American conspiracy brewing to break up China. So what do you think going forward should be India's strategy? You have been studying and observing, and India and friends of Tibet all around the world. What more should we be doing to bring about the desired outcome, which is a Tibet free of coercion, occupation, colonization, and cultural oppression. And we are all obviously concerned about this Chinese expansionism, but maybe we are all falling short in pushing back and in countering it sufficiently, because there is still a thought among, not only here in Delhi, but also in Washington, D.C., in European countries, everywhere, even in Japan, elsewhere, that maybe, you know, China is a fait accompli. Maybe China is, too big to be challenged outrightly or directly, and maybe we have to somehow accommodate China to some extent, which I think is a kind of a, too soft to achieve any long-term goals for Tibet or for Indian security. So please reflect, given your experience in writing and thinking, what more, India and the international community should do for Tibet.
I go there.
You want to go there?
There's some slides.
Sure. But it's visible there.
The screen, that's it.
Where are the slides? It's there. Is that? That the one? Yeah. You'll push the slide.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy today. I feel much younger because Honorable Sikyong said that we met in '87 for the first time. He was a student in Madras Christian College. He had come, we had done a similar exhibition, similar festival 1 week. It was for, but smaller scale than here. We didn't have the means, but I met Sikyong for the first time. And I must mention also my very old first Tibetan friend, Tupten Sambola. I met his daughter after she was a baby like that, and he was one of the most remarkable scholars. And also I must mention His Holiness representative Jingme June. He came to Roville about 35 years ago, and he remembers that we walked together planting a fence. He said representative, at that time he was Cooperative Society Secretary in Collegal. He said normally we don't work, but we all work together. So I think that was all souvenir coming. So I'm grateful to CTA, to DIR, to FNVA, to the USAID for inviting me to speak. So I have some slides. Relevance, next. I can't see, but it doesn't matter. I think the story started when I think Ambassador Sinha has mentioned, when the Chinese warlord, the commissioner of Sichuan, Chaulia, entered Lhasa in 1910, and His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama has to take refuge and escape to India. He lived 2 years in Kalimpong. Now, at that time, the Chinese from Sichuan entered also in the Loit sector. So Loit sector is east of today's Arunachal Pradesh, and they went to one place called Meningkrai, which is just in the suburbs of Wolong. And they put a pillar, Chinese territory. That when the British realized this, the APO, the Assistant Political Officer, I think O'Callaghan his name was, he took that pillar a few months later and wanted to put it in Kibutu, which is the border, the watershed border, what is McMahon Line, would become McMahon Line 4 years later. But it rang some bell in London. They realized suddenly the Chinese can invade these areas and all the northeast of India. So they thought we have to do something about it. And it's how the idea in 1912 came to have a convention. Now, Dalai Lama returned to Lhasa in 1912. 1930, he declared Tibet an independent country. He made a formal declaration. And slowly they start pushing back the Chinese in Sichuan, in the mainland. So the British realized we have to do something. They call a convention in Shimla, and it started in, next slide, it started in October of 1913. So my point that I want to make in showing you these slides, that the border is within India, It's Indo-Tibet border. All the speakers have mentioned it. And during this Shimla conference, during 6 months, next slides, in Shimla, the plenipotentiary of India, which was the Foreign Secretary, Sir Henry McMahon, Ivan Chen, the Chinese plenipotentiary, and Lochen Chatra, the Prime Minister of Tibet, sat at the same rank. There is no difference. There is no one higher, and they acknowledge so I have put slides of the proceeding. Like that, there were 8, 9 meetings, and each time in the proceedings, the 3 plenipotentiary are at the same rank. So it means that for 6 months, China fully recognized that Tibet is a nation, and a nation which can sign an agreement, who can agree to something. So now when they say, since immemorial time, now someone has come in the embassy in Delhi, one spokesperson, she said, she came 1 hour after landing in Delhi, she said that since immemorial time, Tibet has been part. It is not true. In 1913, they sat for 6 months, and they never objected. And I can tell you, I've seen most of the files. All these files, all the copy of this proceeding were going to China, to the mainland, and the nationalist government was waiting, was looking at them and giving the agreement. So they have never objected to that. So it means that is not immemorial time. It's much. It's only in 1950, 51, 49, 50, 51 when they invaded. Next slides. And there was different proposal. Why that? The main purpose of the Shimla conference was to fix the border between Tibet and China. Now, what we don't know that during the 6 months of the conference, war was going on. And slowly the Chinese troops, the Chinese army of Sichuan was repelled and pushed back to China. So the Tibetans were advancing. So it's probably one of the reasons also that Chinese did not object to sit at the same table, because they saw that they were losing, day after day, they were losing ground in eastern Tibet. During the convention, during these 6 months, India sat, Sir Henry McMahon and his assistant Charles Belt sat with the Tibetan representative and decided to fix their border. China didn't say anything. Ivan Chen didn't object. They were sitting together in Shimla. They never objected that they fixed the border between British India and Tibet. So that map was drawn. Next. Different proposals were made. I just should mention in that map that Chinese also agree. On the western sector, or northern sector, the map, the end of the map shows the entire Kunlun as a border. Means in this map, the Aksashin is part of India. So now they have been saying that Aksashin has never been part of India, it was part. But for 6 months again, they did not object to that. Next slide. There was different proposal. The army in London was thinking to put in Sona, much more north. Some people were saying, why don't you put in Sela Pass? Because for defending purpose, it was easier. Finally, it was in between. This map were sent to the Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama in Lhasa. Charles Bell, there's 2 maps like that big, and they sent the draft of the map and for the blessing and the clearance of His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama. He gave the thing, the clearance, and he said. So now today they say that map have never been ratified by the Tibetan government. It's not true. When His Holiness Dalai Lama said clearly it's okay, and it was put in writing by Charles Bells and McMahon that it has been sent to Lhasa and agreed by the 13th Dalai Lama. So this is the map of today of the border. Next map, there was also some difference. Tibetan had to be accommodated. It's in Subansari sector, it doesn't follow the watershed. Everywhere the map, the line follow more or less the watershed. But it is a fact that they don't have the survey equipment that today is available, and at the same time, sometimes there's 2-3 different shades. So if you go in the nitty-gritty, in the details, sometimes there can be problem. But that map is 95% is correct. And in the Subansari sector, the Tibetans mentioned that we have that very famous Tsari pilgrimage. It was like the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra. That was the second most important yatra, and it was happening every 12 years. It was entering India in Migitung Lungchum. It was following the Sari River and going up the Subansari. So half of this pilgrimage was in India and half was in Tibet. So there was some adjustment made, and in that place it didn't follow the watershed. So it means that some of the Tibetans' objection or concerns, not objection, concerns were taken into account before agreeing on the map. Next. So I'll go fast. Next, that finally the China initial the map and the convention, but refused later on to sign it. But it became a valid convention because India and Tibet decided that if China doesn't sign, they will be not enjoying whatever benefit they could have enjoyed at that time. So, and this year is 110 years, so I don't know if there'll be some celebration, but since 110 years, India has a border on paper with Tibet. What is interesting that I've found in the correspondence of Charles Bells, who was assistant of McMahon, he said, why have you not demarked the rest of the border? Means in Sikkim, in the central sector, Uttarakhand, Himachal, and in Ladakh. He said there is no problem there. First, we had no time. We had only 6 months to argue for this China-Tibet border. But the main thing, he said, there's no issue. For example, in the central sector or in Sikkim, it's absolutely at the watershed, and there's very few discrepancies. That's why also there's much less problem. Though China is still claiming some place in like Baroti in the central sector, which are south of the watershed. But if you take the watershed as a principle, there's not big issues. So next. And finally, that map was signed in the end of March of 1914. Now, we call it McMahon line. I've been arguing we should call it McMahon Chatra's line. There's 2 signatures on it, Sir Henry McMahon and Lochen Chatra, the Prime Minister of Tibet, the Sikyong of Tibet. So we should call it the McMahon Chatra's line. And there's no doubt it is an Indo-Tibet border. McMahon, and I think we have done a mistake in India to call it only McMahon line. It should be called McMahon Chatra's line, like the border is Indo-Tibet border. Next. And today, Honorable Sikyong mentioned that they are claiming everything as being there. They published a new map last year in 2023, and 3 times they published a list of names of changing the names. I mean, I think it's just more for propaganda, this changing names. They usually can't pronounce some Tibetan names. Like you have one place called Methok, which is in the great belt of the Yalong Tsampo, and just north of Pasiang district. Now, they can't pronounce Methok. They pronounce Mutao, Chinese. So they will take Mutao and put it in Pinyin, and after that, everyone will say Mutao. But their propaganda is so powerful that progressively, everyone will say Mutao. So I've been fighting with my friend Army and elsewhere. Please use the Tibetan name. Because in the media in India jumps when you say they have changed 6 names or 15 names and one time 21 names. Well, they're changing the name. But they have changed the name of 30,000 or 40,000 villages in Tibet. And some people in the Baltic state, they have done a very good dictionary that I'm using every day with the name in Tibetan script, Tibetan transcript, Chinese name, Chinese Pinyin, and you can get and the coordinate latitude, longitude. That is an extraordinary document. But the fact is that they have changed 30, 40,000. Now today, what is the situation? Their propaganda has never been so powerful. Now, last week in Paris, there is that very famous museum, Guimet Museum. Since maybe 200 years, they are keeping the old Asian piece of art, the very, very famous museum. Now, they do an exhibition on Tibet last week, and they have managed to convince, I don't know how they convinced, they influenced the director, one lady, that Tibet doesn't exist anymore. That is Sikyong, their own name of Tibet. So they force, nobody is forced, but they managed to influence the Musée Guimet Museum to change everything Sikyong autonomous region, Sikyong this, Sikyong that. So this is the southern Sikyong. There, if we don't stop them at one point and come back to the fact that it's Indo-Tibet border, it will go on, and in 5 years' time, the younger generation will all use. And I've seen it when I go sometime on the border with young officers. They say, no, it's, they use the Chinese names only. They said, no, it's Chinese. It's an Indo-China border. One time I had a big fight in near Demchok with one officer. He said, no, you don't know, it's always been Indo-China. Why? Huh? So I think it's very important to teach people in a military academy, in Lalbado Chastri Academy, IS, and also the media. Because the latest thing, there were some yaks who crossed the border in Ladakh, and they say Chinese yaks. Since when we have Chinese yaks?
No visa.
At least the media should be told that it is Tibetan yaks who are crossing. I don't know why we know why they're pushing the yaks, but that is a fact. So I think we should stick to the Indo-Tibet and McMahon Chatra's line.
Thank you, sir.
First step forward. About the fingers, I think it's a fake quotation. Everyone is using. It's an excellent quotation. Mao Zedong would have said that Tibet is a palm and the 5 fingers. No, Nifa and Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal and Ladakh. Yeah. That is excellent. It's just very. But I think it's fake. I've looked for years.
There's no original source.
I think it's Ambassador Gupta once mentioned to me, I'm writing something. Where did you get this quotation? You have quoted it. And after that, that was maybe 15 years ago. And I keep looking, and I was 100% it's not Mao Zedong who said it. But it's a very good quotation.
Maybe apocryphal. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been hearing top experts and thinkers on India and Tibet and China and world situation. I think the important point Claude Arpi made is about what we call the cartographic aggression of China. They have this tradition of presenting maps, changing names, and General Bhatia was also saying that they have this step-by-step method of colonization. And we heard earlier also about how communism is based on lies and on domination. So it's quite clear that there is a big threat up north and that we are really feeling the brunt of it, with 60,000 troops nearly mobilized for last almost 4 years and no de-escalation happening, and also constant state of alert all along the LAC. With fresh attempts at infiltration. We are happy to note that at least some incidents have come to light where it seems the US intelligence supported and gave us advance information through which we could thwart some of the infiltrations in Tawang sector. And I think increasingly it is quite clear that India must collaborate with like-minded strategic partners to be able to deal with this challenge. And I think that I'm sure everybody agrees that we should go forward on that front. And as far as Tibet being some kind of a card that can be dispensed or used as a bargaining chip, that's again probably a misunderstanding of the Chinese state and especially the current regime of Xi Jinping. Because if you yield an inch, they will ask you for the yard, That is the kind of mindset. So I don't think any compromise is really possible. There are some who are even saying in India that, we should not be so closely aligned with the United States. We should maybe go back to non-alignment, meaning equidistance between China and the US. When you have 60,000 troops, breathing down our necks, and when they're challenging us, how can we be equidistant? There's just no question of that, right? So there are so Tibet is in many ways the crucible through which our larger strategy and grand strategy has to be reformulated. And the first step that Claude Arpi is asking us all, not only the state, but ordinary citizens, there are a lot of young people here in the audience, we must go back and maintain the original names and the nomenclatures which have lasted for millennia, and how can they just change it in 5 years or in 1 year or in 10 years, right? So this is the so-called communist revolutionary mindset, which is to erase everything. And our panelists also mentioned. We have time for one last round where I want shorter responses from each of you, especially keeping the youth in mind. Excellency Sikyong, how can the young people of India, we have a huge youth bulge and a demographic advantage. We are going to be young when China will be old. We will be equal of China in GDP and in military power in due time. We will be a great power like the US and China, right? But how can we, and it is all going to be driven by the young people. So what is the CTA doing to maintain the links between the youth of India and your youth, the Tibetan youth? How can we make sure that the youth of India are not normalizing what the Chinese want us to normalize? And what are you doing and what more you can do to make sure that the next generation, there are a lot of seniors here, but with due respect to them, 20, 30, 50 years down the line, the ones in the back, the young people, they are going to be leading, And how can we build the bonds between the Tibetan young people and India's young people so that this special relationship will last forever and the understanding will be always there?
Thank you. Oftentimes we live under the illusion that since we have been in India for so long, in my case, born here, we believe that Indians know about Tibet. But unfortunately, when you speak individually with a lot of Indians, it's very rare that Indians know about Tibet. So we have to create a lot of awareness. I've been traveling around the world, reached out to about 24 different countries, traveled to different universities from Colombia to Mexico to United States to UK, where I spoke at many universities, including Oxford, Westminster, Warwick, and Aberdeen in the UK. And in India, we started this year to reach out to the Indian youth, starting from Bangalore, the state where I come from, to speak to the students about Tibet, cover the basics, just area, location, why Tibet is, geostrategically important, environmentally important, the importance of Tibetan Buddhist culture for promotion of peace in the world, and then the situation in Tibet, all of those. In Bangalore, I've covered Mount Carmel's College, I've covered St. Joseph's University and Ramaya University. Day after tomorrow, I'm going to Symbiosis in Pune to speak to the younger generation, and from this year to next year, we will be covering a lot more universities to speak about Tibet and its relation with India, because even elderly people don't know too many details about Tibet-India relations. So I think that there is definitely more need for awareness creation, which it'll not be me doing, but you have all the members of the core group who had a meeting representing from Pondicherry, from Karnataka, from everywhere, from Arunachal Pradesh, who happens to be the co-convener. So you have all the members of the core group also from Central India, North India. Professor Anand Kumarji is also here from the Indo-Tibetan Friendship Society. So all the Tibet support groups are here. So we have to do this in a concerted way, working with the core group members from different regions to reach out to different colleges and universities, and we will be pushing this forward.
That's great, sir. That's great. We need more of that. Ambassador Sinha, I was in China a few years ago when they were, the Friendship Association, they keep hosting Indian delegations. I remember the Communist Party head of the India Friendship Association, he thumped his fist on the table and said, the big problem for India from our point of view is you got the Dalai Lama, on your soil, and this is a bigger threat to the national security of China than United States supplying missiles to Taiwan. And he said, we can handle the missiles, we got enough firepower to deter the Americans in the Pacific. But you people are harboring the Dalai Lama. There's a lot of speculation about the future of the Tibetan leadership, with His Holiness getting on in age. The Chinese have the strategy. There's so much parlor games being played. What do you think India's position should be on this issue, and how can we briefly make sure that this great institution that has survived for so many centuries remains intact and does not get become another pawn or suborned into the this renaming or reclaiming business of the Chinese?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, but we have to remember that in India-China relations, the problem is not the border. The problem is Tibet. And China realizes that. Now, China hopes that after His Holiness, that then they'll be able to break this link between Tibet and India, and they'll be able to establish their control over Tibet. Now, one of the problems that the regime, the governmental structure earlier in Tibet was that the interregnum between two Dalai Lamas was always a period of instability, because the interregnum was very long between the time of the passing away of one Dalai Lama and the second Dalai Lama, the next Dalai Lama growing up. Now, that interregnum was very long. Now, fortunately now, His Holiness has passed all his political powers to the CTA. So that is what is important today, that the succession issue is now an issue of the religious order. So that is for the religious order to decide and take forward. As far as the political issue is concerned, it is the Central Tibetan Administration, which is the Tibetan government in exile, which has to take the leadership forward, provide leadership to the Tibetan movement. And that is where governments like in India should be working towards, to strengthen the administration and to raise the stature so that people like the Sikyong are able to lead the movement forward in the years to come.
Well said, sir, well said. Let me bring in General Bhatia also briefly for your comments. So going forward, is there, a chance of a limited war? Everybody, it's in the back of our mind since Galwan, as you mentioned. Is there a chance of a limited war in some sectors with the Chinese? And if so, while we are prepared, could this also help to reconfigure the balance of power in the region, and could this bring in Tibet into play once again, its status of Tibet, if there is a clash which is much wider than what we saw in Galwan, involving firepower and all that? And so it's not just about us deterring them, but always Tibet will come into play whenever there is a clash, isn't it? So would you like to say anything about the possibility of a limited war?
Absolutely. The war is always the last resort, but it is the last resort. So when I say possibility of limited war, I will not even say limited war, the possibility of war. But the fact remains that the strategic intent can change anytime. Like we saw Hindi Chini Bye-Bye 2.0 going on very well till about April of 2020. And then suddenly we find China, our two leaders had met 19 times in 5 years. And suddenly we find that the Chinese have come and done a forward deployment and occupied some areas along the line of actual control. So, but that's where war prevention deterrence comes into play. If we are strong enough, and strong enough on the both along the Indo-Tibetan border and strong enough in the seas, China will not wage a war. But if we are weak, yes, definitely. Why should it not? And today war is not a linear war as it is, it's a multi-domain war. There's a war already on. Because China is into an information war, into a cognitive war. If you look at what China is doing, it has got a national services department which is going to information war. Today everything is Chinese. Our children, if they look at cartoons, they're Chinese characters. Today Hollywood is controlled by China. So there's a cognitive war already in place. So we'll have to look at the multi-domain warfare. You look at the villages, 660 villages. It is called the Great Chinese Wall of Villages. And Claude Law will bear me out. 660 odd villages all along the border areas. So he's already into a state of war. It may not be the war as we see it, linear war, as we see it, but these wars will continue, and that is where you got to prepare. Cyber wars. If I can take a minute more. I was talking to someone from the L&T, and they said there's a tunnel boring machines which they use for the metros. So that had gone off-road. So they tried to repair it, the machine can't come back, so they tried to repair it, they couldn't repair it. So they went to the OEM, which is the original manufacturer, equipment manufacturer, and this machine gone bad. He says, no, it's not gone bad. You're not paid your installment, so we stopped it. So there's a chip inside. Okay. So today's the supply chain infection, even the mic I'm speaking would have Chinese parts. You have a phone, a mobile phone, 5,000 data points are with China. Please understand that. Each one of us. So that is where China has got a head start. And if we do not understand the threat of China, we cannot negate that threat. Thank you.
Right. We are already at war, and we should understand the threat. Very important point. Last but not least, Claude, Arpi. Tibet, great civilization, great culture, has given so many extraordinary pearls of wisdom on the basis of which people are finding solace and peace of mind all over. His Holiness is not just a spiritual leader for Tibetans. He's actually a global guru, isn't it? So India, we feel specially for such figures because of our own tradition of reverence for those who are saints and sages and sadhus. So this spiritual side, we are also celebrating the spirit of Tibet these 2 days here. Is it enough for Tibet to maintain that civilizational core, and how do we do it when on the other side, it's being erased systematically, as you have pointed out, and many others? What is our message to the Tibetan sisters and brothers who are under occupation on the other side? And what should we be doing more from our side in India to connect with them, despite the barriers and the firewalls and the restrictions that the Chinese impose to separate the Tibetans on both sides?
I don't know if I can answer, but this is very difficult communicating today. Like I was telling some friend yesterday, China has recognized their own Panchen Lama, Gyatsen Nobu. He went to the border to this first place, Lloyd, north of Kibutu, last week. It was at the same time His Holiness came from New York to Zurich. Now, this Gyatsen Nobu, there was, I look at the videos and the picture, there was 20, 30 people around, Tibetans. His Holiness, he had 17,000 people in New York, and 10,000, and it was booked. They could have, if they had been able to accommodate more people, they would have been double. Now, it shows the difference between His Holiness and the person who is going to be saved. Now, how to pass this information to Tibet? So I think I'll leave it to Honorable Sikyong to find ways, but we have to find ways. Even army, everybody has to find ways to communicate with the people, that they should know that this has happened, because it's something that they cannot do. You see, if you mentioned this Sikyong village, 620 or 50, whatever, on the border. Now, if you look at this village, I've looked at hundreds of pictures, I've collected videos, and there's not a single prayer flag. There's no stupa, there's no gompa. So I'm telling my friend in Ladakh, and And I think the army has taken it seriously. 14 Corps is really trying to celebrate His Holiness' birthday on 6 July, you know. But you should amplify this so that the message goes on the other side. Here there is a freedom. Your roads are maybe better, but there is a freedom. And if you allow me to add one word about what Honorable Sikyong said about telling the youth of India. I've been thinking on one thing, I've been working on it, it's very difficult, but we should include it somehow one day in the textbooks. So some new textbooks have been recently released. It's very difficult, but because at the end of the day, you have to go get the clearance from the MEA. And MEA will be the last one to change the One China policy and all these things. But we, at least in IMA or NDA or other places, but one day you should target that to change the textbooks so the kids in 6th or 10th standard, they know that it is Indo-Tibet border. Thank you.
Right. Here there is, friends, Claude Arpi is saying here there is freedom and on that side there is oppression. That's the reality. That is why spirit of Tibet is being held in the land of freedom, India. And it's a very emotional thing for all of us. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the strategic realities facing us, the threats and the challenges. And there is no question that the freedom of Tibet, in whatever form, will ultimately determine the stable equation between India and China, and probably even the balance of power in Asia. So there are big stakes here. And sometimes you hear more about Xinjiang and about what's happening to the Uyghurs there, because that has come up more recently. But the plunder and the destruction and the forcible assimilation of Tibet that has happened is a bigger tragedy and longer one. And I think the purpose of this panel and what all of the panelists are saying is that if we do not amplify this cause, if we do not resist the forcible assimilation that is happening, and if we do not call the Chinese out, then, over time, through lapse, the Chinese have this so-called 100-year marathon. They will eventually, succeed in absorbing and in completely decimating a proud ancient civilization which had its own kingdom and its own state at one point in time. So it's very important that we in India rise to the occasion and don't let this moment pass where we are slowly drifting and saying, okay, what can we do? We should not normalize what the Chinese want us to normalize. So that is the message of this panel. I want to thank each of them for extraordinary insights. Please, can we have a standing ovation, because there's such giants here sitting with me on the stage.
Chairman, can I add one sentence? I just want to add something that in 85 I had gone to Dharamsala. I was very young and brave. I was my motorbike and my wife. And when I reached there, they told me, go back to Delhi. His Holiness will give you an audience in Delhi. His Holiness, I asked him this. He said, Tibetan 6 million, China's 1 billion. And he laughed. He said, we can't do anything. We have to keep our culture. And that's, I think, what has been done in this exhibition. And he said, something will happen to China. And I still believe, it was 39 years ago, I still believe in that thing.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists for their enlightening contribution to this session.
Thank you.